You've probably heard the story, right? This really powerful idea that the First World War just, boom, changed everything for women. That it single-handedly yanked them out of the home, threw them into factories, and kicked off a whole new era of freedom. It's a great story, a sudden dramatic revolution. But is it really what happened? That's the big question we're going to dig into. Was the war really this one big event that set women free? Or, is the real story a little more complicated? Let's peel back the layers and see if we can separate the facts from the fiction. Okay, so to get what happened, you have to picture Britain in 1914. The country is suddenly plunged into war. And what does that mean? It means millions and millions of men are leaving their jobs, their farms, their factories, and heading off to fight. And that leaves a gigantic hole in the country's workforce. I want you to really let this number sink in for a second. 6 million. That's how many working-age men were pulled out of the economy and into the military. Just think about what that does to a country. Your entire industrial engine is at risk of just stopping. It was a crisis on a scale that nobody had ever seen before. So, who stepped up to fill that huge gap? Women. 1.7 million women entered the workforce to keep the country and the war effort going. And let's be clear, this wasn't just a few more women getting jobs. This was a massive, unprecedented mobilization. And the result? Well, by the end of the war, the workforce looked totally different. By 1918, women made up more than a third of all workers in Britain, 37%. That's a huge leap from just 24% before the war. So what exactly were they all doing? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Women started moving into jobs that would have been absolutely unthinkable for them just a few years before. They were leaving those traditional roles, like being a maid, and they were stepping onto factory floors, into offices, and even out onto the streets in brand new ways. I mean, just look at this list. We're talking about heavy industry, engineering, shipbuilding. These were tough, physically demanding, skilled jobs that were seen as exclusively men's work. Women were driving buses, working in banks, farming the land, and even joining auxiliary military services. This just completely shattered that old Victorian idea of women as the weaker sex. And the growth in some of these sectors is just mind-blowing. In transport, the number of women working went from about 18,000 to over 100,000. And get this, in banking and finance, it shot up by 600%. This wasn't just filling in a few gaps. It was like women were taking over entire parts of the economy. But, and this is a really big but, we can't romanticize this. On the one hand, sure, there was a promise of better pay, a new kind of financial freedom they'd never known. But on the other hand, the danger was very, very real, especially for the munitionettes. The work was filthy, the hours were brutal, and they were working with toxic chemicals. Hundreds of women were killed in horrific factory explosions. This new freedom came at a huge cost. Okay, so the story seems pretty clear, right? War comes, women get jobs, revolution. Well, not so fast. This is where this simple narrative starts to fall apart a little. Because the first thing you have to realize is that the war wasn't really the starting point. It was more like an accelerant. Here's something a lot of people forget. Millions of women were already working before 1914. Yeah, a lot of them were in traditional jobs like domestic service, but a shift was already happening. More and more women were becoming typists, telephone operators, shop assistants. A small but really important number were even breaking into professions like medicine and teaching. So the war didn't light the match. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire that was already burning. And that brings us to the second big crack in the revolution story. And honestly, this might be the most important part. If the war created this incredible job boom for women, did it actually last? Let's take a look at what happened the minute the war was over. This little table right here tells an absolutely massive story. Just look at those numbers. At the peak in 1918, women are 37% of the workforce. Awesome. But just 2 years later, in 1920, that number has crashed back down to 28%. That's barely higher than where it was before the war even started. It's like the tide went out just as fast as it came in. And why did this happen? Well, the attitude at the time was pretty straightforward. Everyone, from the government to the trade unions to just society in general, saw women's work as a temporary fix. It was an emergency measure. The message was basically, thanks for your help, ladies. We couldn't have done it without you. Now the men are back, so you can go home. So, if most of the jobs disappeared, was it all for nothing? Was it all just a temporary blip? No way. Absolutely not. Because the real legacy of the war wasn't about the employment stats. It was about the deeper changes in politics and in society that just could not be reversed. You have to remember, the suffragettes had been fighting for the vote for decades. In 1915, they made a really smart move. They suspended their protests and marched with banners like this one, basically tying their patriotism and their willingness to serve the country directly to their demand for political rights. And that was the key that finally unlocked the door. After 4 years of seeing women build the shells, drive the buses, and nurse the wounded, the old arguments that women were too emotional or not smart enough to vote, well, they just sounded ridiculous. You couldn't ignore their contribution. The resistance to giving them the vote just crumbled. And getting the vote was just the beginning. That political momentum led to actual legal changes. You get things like the 1919 Sex Disqualification Act, which made it illegal to keep women out of professions like law just because they were women. The law was finally starting to catch up with reality. And beyond all the politics, the social changes were just huge. It was in the little things. Clothing got more practical, women cut their hair. For the first time, many had experienced what it was like to have their own money, to live away from home, to have a bit of freedom. And they started to challenge those little social rules, like, being able to walk into a pub by themselves. These things might seem small, but they symbolized a massive shift in confidence. So let's go back to our big question. Did World War I liberate women? Well, it's not a simple yes or no, is it? It wasn't a revolution that gave them full equality overnight. But it was a catalyst. A massive one. It completely smashed old ideas about what women could do, and it won them huge political victories. You could say the war kicked the door to equality wide open, which leaves us with a final thought. If the door was open, why did it take so many more decades to fully walk through it?